Hello, my name is Russell Williams. I teach in the Comparative Literature and English department at the American University of Paris. I'm really pleased to be contributing to the Learning Laboratory. What I'd like to do in this session is to give you an overview of what I've been thinking about over the past few months, particularly as the world responds to the COVID-19 health crisis by self-isolating, by us all shutting ourselves away, as the wheels of society as we know it have sort of come to stop turning. Self-isolation and how literature deals with that experience has been one of the themes in the background of my research for a little while. So firstly, what I'd like to do is to think about how my work responds to our current historical moment before briefly thinking about how that work relates to my next bigger research project, of which I'm currently thinking about developing at the moment. As a professor of literature, many of the things I've been thinking about as part of my research have included writers who think hard about self-isolation, about what it means to withdraw, to retreat from society, what it means to take a sidestep out of the ebbs and flows of the everyday mainstream, withdrawing from jobs, taking a space outside of the economy, not showing a lot of interest in the mainstream entertainment industry. So when the French president Emmanuel Macron appeared on television back in March to tell people they were going to have to stay in, my immediate thought was to turn to literature to see what we can learn from novels. I ended up writing a short piece which was published online by 3am magazine, which should hopefully be in the links below. Now, when the period of self-isolation started, there were a few books that media and literary journalists got very excited about. One of those, of course, was Boccaccio's 14th century Decameron. You've got Albert Camus' La Peste. You've got, in the American tradition, Thoreau's iconic 1854 Walden. All of those masterpieces, all of those hugely influential. But in terms of my own research, what I'm more interested in is there is a body of work, there is a slightly more unconventional, less well-known collection of writing that deals with, articulates and shares a more everyday sense of self-isolation, one that just might tell us something about what it means to hide ourselves away in spring 2020. The most contemporary of these is Ottessa Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation, published in 2018, which stages experiments with human hibernation centered around a protagonist who bases her retreat on the recuperative potential of sleep. This novel actually plays with two forms of withdrawal. The first sees the protagonist quit her job, take a load of prescription drugs, spending her days drowsily watching Whoopi Goldberg and Harrison Ford films on VHS. Then things get a little darker as she realizes that the drugs she's been taking have actually been forcing her to sleepwalk at night outside her Manhattan apartment. She takes drastic action, getting a friend to lock her in the apartment as she ups her dose so she can sleep for pretty much 3 months straight. What's the outcome of all this? Well, she does succeed in sustaining a complete, committed, even impressive form of social distancing. She sort of attains, if not an epiphany, but a moment of clarity. At the end of her confinement, she sits in a park and watches, and this is a quote, she watches a bee circle the heads of a flock of passing teenagers. There was majesty and grace in the swaying branches of the willows. There was kindness. Pain is not the touchstone for growth, I said to myself. My sleep had worked. I was soft and calm and felt things. This was good. This all seems a little bit too easy for me. In many ways, Moshfegh's unnamed narrator presents a rather cliched notion of the kind of self-development that we hope temporary withdrawal can bring about. This may or may not be the case, but it feels a little bit over-optimistic, a little bit simplistic, not least in an age of social media where we are consistently undermining our own tranquility by scrolling through Twitter feeds, exposing ourselves to the mental stress that online panic brings with it. Surely self-isolation is actually a little bit more complicated than that. Perhaps a more realistic assessment comes from a 17th century mathematician philosopher Blaise Pascal, who famously noted in his Pensées, quote, I have discovered that all of the happiness of men arises from one single fact, that they cannot stay quietly in their own chamber. Now, In terms of the literature of self-isolation, most of the most interesting creative work gets to grips with Pascal's conclusion. Much of it also comes from the French-speaking world. Perhaps most eccentrically, the Belgian Jean-Philippe Toussaint's The Bathroom starts with a protagonist who initially refuses to leave his bathroom. But the restless itch identified by Pascal sees him seeking out a range of different opportunities to stay in. He relocates to Venice, but spends too much time hanging around his hotel. Then he decides to withdraw by checking into hospital. What does he learn from his experiences in retreat? Not a great deal. Above all, he discovers that he really likes staying inside. If there is any payoff in terms of solace or comfort in the bathroom, it seems to be primarily aesthetic, received by the reader. Toussaint's novel is presented in a series of exquisitely crafted and numbered minimalist paragraphs, each of them a perfect stylistic exercise. Toussaint has, it seemed, turned staying in into a productive literary constraint. Now, a more extreme example, perhaps from the Toussaint, certainly explicitly more Pascalian, is Georges Perec's Un homme qui dort, A Man Asleep, published in 1967. Here, a young Parisian student, suffering from what sounds distinctly like a severe dose of depression, opts to ignore his friends, flunk his university exams, and instead spend his days staring at the ceiling in his apartment, detailing minutely his shelving units, his ceiling, his breakfast crockery. He eventually makes the decision to wander the streets, maintaining a state of careful indifference to those he encounters in the dark Paris night. At the close of the novel, narrated in the accusatory second person, however, he realises it's all been a bit of a waste of time. He hasn't been able to sit quietly in his own chamber, but neither has his nocturnal lonely wandering done anything other than darken his mood. The quote, "You learned nothing, except that solitude teaches you nothing, that indifference teaches you nothing. It was a distraction, a fascinating yet flawed illusion. Your refusal is useless, your neutrality means nothing, your inertia is as vain as your rage." So, what's the point? So far then, so bleak. But maybe, just maybe, there is a glimmer of hope in the field of the literature of self-isolation. And maybe that glimmer comes in the shape of an undiscovered gem, a novel by Eugène Ionesco, the only novel that this famous absurdist playwright wrote. And one of my missions is to get people talking about Le Solitaire, translated as The Hermit. It's a wonderful book. It recounts the tale of a young, unremarkable office worker who, out of the blue, receives an inheritance windfall from a forgotten uncle. Rather than any grand gestures, our narrator opts to quietly retire from life. He acquires a modest apartment in a sleepy part of town and gently settles into a life of gentle routine, perusing the newspaper, losing himself in philosophy, and contemplating the sacks of food and cases of wine his housekeeper has ordered in. Ionesco's novel was written against the backdrop of the May 1968 protests, and violent insurrection becomes increasingly prominent as the novel proceeds. Our narrator, however, really isn't interested in revolutionary politics, instead preferring to peer bemusingly out of his window or dining at the same time every day in his local bistro, drinking heavily as the structures and the buildings of contemporary society collapse around him. He eventually opts to definitively barricade himself inside. Ionesco's narrator ultimately casts doubts on the firmness of Pascal's conclusions. Staying in his chamber doesn't really pose too much of a problem for him, although admittedly the fine wine helps. Eventually, after weeks, months, perhaps even years, he's not quite sure, the hermit toys with the idea of emerging from his hibernation, and the novel closes on a note of oddly ambiguous optimism. One morning, our hero is awakened by the chirping of birds. Glancing out of the window, he notes an all-white tree in full flower, which has emerged through the piles of garbage in his courtyard. He reaches out and plucks 3 immaculate flowers. The tree soon vanishes, yet the flowers remain. It comes back later that day with the vision of a meadow and a weird hovering silver ladder prompting the novel's final words. I took that for a sign. A sign of what? We never discover, but a sign of something. So this is what I was thinking about. Magic ladders and retreat and aesthetic perfection earlier in confinement. But how do we reconcile that as part of a bigger research project? Well, very quickly, I think it all relates to what we think about, what we speak about, what we talk about when we articulate the act of reading. More precisely, how we focus when we turn our attention onto precise tasks. What happens to concentration in the contemporary moment? What is the relationship between reading and confinement? What is the status of reading, our engagement with long literary novels, when our attention is increasingly under attack from social media, from what Shoshana Zuboff has described as surveillance capitalism? Novels might describe the act of retreat, as Perec, Moshfegh, Ionesco all do. But to what extent does the physical act of reading give us, as readers, our own point of resistance to the online world, to the mainstream? What is the relationship between long lyrical sentences and the languages of social media? What about looking at visual art? What about listening to music? All of these things are things I will be thinking about over the months ahead, and I look forward to sharing my thoughts and findings with you as they develop. But until then, goodbye for now.